I never thought much about Emily Rayner's house before that night. I'd been to sleepovers plenty of times, and I'd walked past her home countless mornings, backpack slung over my shoulder, wishing I had that kind of big porch swing or those white picket fences. But it was one of those places that looked perfect only from the outside. The inside? I didn't know then. I never would forget. It started like any other Friday. School had been draining. Emily and I passed notes during fourth period, laughing about homework we hadn't done and joking about how Mr. Campbell's beard made him look like a wizard who'd lost his mind. "You coming over tonight?" she asked, pencil tapping on her notebook. I nodded eagerly, stuffing my own notbook into my backpack before the bell rang. I hadn't considered the consequences. Who thinks about consequences when they're 15 and trust comes naturally? Her mom, Denise, was friendly but polite in that way adults are when they're pretending everything's normal. Stepdad Carl always had that permanent half-smile, the kind you knew could vanish in a heartbeat if you annoyed him. And then there was Mason, her older brother, the one you never saw much but somehow made you uncomfortable even when he wasn't around. People like Mason have a way of filling the room with tension just by existing. Emily didn't talk much about him. When she did, it was clipped, like she'd learned early that words about him could lead to trouble. When my mom dropped me off, Emily greeted me at the door with a tight smile. "Hey, Jenna," she said, voice wavering slightly. "Come on in. Mom made dinner soon." I followed her, kicking off my shoes and smelling the faint smoke of firewood mixed with the cinnamon of some air freshener. Everything smelled normal. Too normal. Dinner was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you like a thin blanket, giving just enough warmth to make you feel safe while hiding the chill beneath. Denise asked about school, about homework, and about our plans for the weekend. Emily barely answered. I nudged her under the table, whispering, "What's up?" She just shook her head, biting her lip. I didn't push further. Something was off. Later, we retreated to her room. Posters of bands and movie stills covered the walls, a soft pink glow from her string lights illuminating stacks of books and snack wrappers. She sat on her bed, knees pulled to her chest. "Mason texted," she said finally. My stomach sank. He's coming back tonight." I frowned. "Wait, he's not supposed to be here, right? Didn't Carl kick him out?" Emily's eyes dropped to her lap. "Yeah, last time wasn't good." I nodded slowly, not wanting to push her. I didn't know what that meant. All I knew was that I felt something twist in my stomach, a sense of dread I'd never felt before. The rest of the evening was spent trying to act normal. We watched The Conjuring, laughed at the cheap scares, ate chips, but the clock hands moved faster than they should have. The house settled into a quiet rhythm that felt unnatural, like the calm before a storm. Then it came. The slam of the front door. The sharp, sudden sound made me jump. Emily froze, her knuckles white around the blanket she clutched. The next few moments were a blur of muffled voices, sharp words, and a cold realization that Mason wasn't just coming over. He was here to hurt them. I'll never forget the first sound. It wasn't a scream or a crash. It was worse. The unmistakable roar of a gunshot, echoing through the quiet house like thunder in a library. Denise screamed. Carl shouted something I couldn't catch. Then the air smelled metallic and hot. Emily bolted for the stairs. "No!" I grabbed her wrist, yanking her back toward the safety of her room. Her wide eyes met mine, shimmering with fear. "We have to lock the door." I pushed the dresser against it, praying it would hold. The wood creaked under the pressure, groaning in warning. The thud of boots on the stairs was slow at first, deliberate, then faster as Mason climbed toward us. His voice, calm and terrifying, echoed through the hallway. "You think you can hide, Em?" Emily fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 in a trembling whisper. I heard her voice barely carrying over the line. "Please. He's trying to kill us." Mason began pounding on the door. Splinters flew. I grabbed Emily's hand, yanking her toward the window. 2 stories, I hissed. We have to jump. The fear in her eyes mirrored my own. My heart pounded like a drum, loud enough that I felt sure he could hear it. We climbed out onto the porch roof. I landed first, rolling to absorb the impact. Emily followed, hitting the grass hard, breathless. Behind us, Mason leaned out the window, shotgun glinting in the faint moonlight. His laughter carried, twisted and sharp. I wanted to throw up from adrenaline and terror all at once. We ran toward the woods, barefoot, branches slapping against our arms, leaves cutting into our skin. My lungs burned. Every step felt like running toward something unknown. But worse than the dark was the sound of him chasing us, relentless and laughing. Eventually we found a neighbor's cabin, an old man named Mr. Hollis. He ushered us inside, locking the door behind us. My knees gave way. I didn't cry. I couldn't. My chest heaved with raw panic, and yet there was a sliver of relief. We had survived. By the time the police arrived, it was too late for Denise and Carl. Mason had fled, only to be arrested later, wandering barefoot on the road, muttering incoherently to himself. The news footage was brief. The neighbors whispered about the tragedy for weeks. No one seemed to know what drove Mason to it, and no one cared to ask about Emily's nights spent hiding under her bed, fearing the family that had once seemed ordinary. Emily stayed with relatives for months. I testified during the trial, recounting everything I saw, the way his eyes looked, the sound of the first gunshot, the panic that made us jump from a second-story window. Mason got life without parole. Emily changed her name and moved across the country. I didn't sleep over anywhere else after that. Even now, the memory of that night sits heavy in my chest. It's not just that a murderer lived in the house. It's that he lived with people we trusted. Monsters don't always lurk in dark forests or empty alleys. Sometimes they eat dinner with you. Weeks later, I still couldn't sleep. I kept picturing Mason's face, pale, twisted in rage, laughing as we ran barefoot through the rain-slicked woods. I imagined him waiting in corners, in classrooms, anywhere I felt safe. Every creak in the floor sounded like his boots. Every knock on the door made my heart jump. I told myself it wasn't rational, that he couldn't be everywhere at once, that the world still had safe corners. But the lesson had sunk in early. Trust was fragile, and danger often wears a familiar face. I avoided Emily's old house whenever I walked past Hollow Creek Road. The swing still creaked, though no one ever sat on it. The windows reflected the autumn sun, clean and ordinary, but I couldn't look at them the same way. School went on. Teachers asked me if I was okay, if I wanted to talk. I nodded because what could I say? Your best friend's family was murdered, and I watched her jump out of a second-story window to survive. No one wants to hear that. Years have passed since that night. I graduated high school, went to college, and learned to navigate the world with a cautious eye. I still have nightmares of Mason's laughter echoing through trees, of Emily's terrified face pressed against mine as we leapt from the window. But I also learned something else. The kind of lesson no textbook can teach. Courage isn't about fighting the monster in front of you. It's about choosing to act when you feel powerless, finding a way to survive when the world is upside down. I haven't had a sleepover since. I don't hand my trust lightly. I watch the people around me carefully. But I also live with gratitude. Every morning I wake up. Every evening I close the door behind me. I remember that survival is an act of quiet defiance, and sometimes that's enough. Monsters don't always lurk in shadows. They often sit at our tables, smile in our faces, and call us family. The greatest lesson is not just to survive, but to recognize danger, act decisively, and trust your instincts, even when it means questioning the safety of those you thought you could rely on. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the strength to move forward despite it. I've always been the quiet one, the kind of kid who watches the world from the edges. Maybe that's why I noticed things before anyone else did. My little brother, Toby, came into our lives when I was 12, and everything changed. I thought babies meant joy, laughter, diapers, and lullabies. But Toby brought something else: fear. My parents, Rachel and Victor Simmons, were careful before, but with him, they were obsessive. Windows had locks, doors had double latches, and every inch of the nursery was monitored. Cameras glared down at him from the ceiling, and the keypad on the door beeped every time someone approached. I wasn't allowed to go in alone, not even for a minute. My parents hovered constantly, checking his temperature, counting his breaths, making him wear a blanket tucked so tightly it seemed he could barely move. At first, I thought it was just extra attention. They wanted to be good parents. But there was a tension that crept into the walls, a heaviness that made me flinch when I entered the room. One night I woke to a faint scratching sound. It was soft, like tiny claws tapping against the crib rails. My heart thumped, and I froze listening. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch unnaturally long. Through the slit in the nursery door, I peered in. Toby's eyes were half closed, his chest rising and falling slowly. Nothing moved. Nothing should have. Yet the sound persisted for a few more seconds before fading into silence. Morning came, and I found faint scratches along the crib rails. I asked Toby if he had fallen. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at me with dull, glassy eyes. I tried talking to my parents. "Mom, Toby has scratches. Did he fall?" Rachel shook her head, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped the crib with a fresh cloth soaked in alcohol. "No, Clara. You don't understand. The world is dangerous. Germs, sickness, intruders, and they're everywhere. You can't let him touch anything. Not yet." Victor's jaw was tight, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the crib. "You're too young to help. Stay out." I began keeping notes in secret, hiding them under the loose floorboards in my room. Tiny details, little pieces of evidence that something wasn't right. The scratches, the constant sedatives, the way Toby seemed to shrink under their care. I wrote every observation, every moment that didn't make sense. My parents would never believe me, but maybe someday someone else would. The weeks passed and Toby faded. His skin lost its soft pink glow. His cheeks were pale, almost translucent. He barely spoke, barely smiled. At night, I lay awake, listening to the creaks and murmurs of the house, feeling trapped in the same prison my brother was. And then came the moment I couldn't ignore anymore. I heard it again, scratching, persistent and deliberate, at exactly 2:47 a.m. I slipped out of bed, my heart hammering against my ribs. I knelt by the nursery door and whispered, "Toby, it's me. Come on." For a brief, terrifying second, he blinked, his eyes wide, almost pleading. I unlocked the crib and lifted him gently, cradling his tiny body against mine. He was light, too light, and I realized just how little he had been allowed to move or grow. My parents' obsession had nearly destroyed him. We ran barefoot through the cold, dark hallway, through the front door, and into the biting winter air. I pounded on the neighbor's door until a light flicked on. They stared at us wide-eyed as Toby clung to me, shivering. Finally, someone called 911. That night, the world opened up again, but the fear never left me. The police arrived in minutes, and I found myself repeating everything I'd seen and felt over the past weeks. My voice trembled, and sometimes my words faltered. They wouldn't let him breathe. They gave him medicine. He barely... I don't know. Detectives scribbled notes, asked careful questions, and examined Toby. I watched them, terrified and relieved all at once. Relief that someone finally believed me. Terror because I knew what my parents could do if they found out I'd helped him escape. Rachel and Victor were arrested on the spot. The courtroom later echoed with terms I didn't fully understand: child abuse, unlawful confinement, negligence. But I knew the truth from the start. My parents weren't monsters from fairy tales. They were real people, convinced that the outside world was a threat to the point of obsession. After that, I stayed with social workers, clutching Toby close. He slept through the night for the first time in months. His tiny body finally relaxed. Watching him, I realized how fragile life could be when love becomes suffocating. But the nightmares didn't end. Every night at exactly 2:47 a.m., I'd wake up, heart racing, imagining scratches across the walls, the floor, the crib. Sometimes Toby stirred, eyes opening briefly, only to close again, half asleep. It was as if the fear had become embedded in him, a permanent echo of what he'd endured. School became strange. Friends whispered about my parents' arrest, but no one really understood what had happened. I tried to explain, but their eyes were filled with pity, not comprehension. Nobody knew the careful, terrifying rhythm of our house, the way our lives had been controlled down to every breath, every small motion. I began writing again, filling journals with every memory, every sound. Every detail mattered. I had to prove to myself that I wasn't imagining it, that the terror had been real. One afternoon, the social worker, Mrs. Henderson, brought Toby and me to a park. I'd never been allowed to take him outside alone, never allowed to let him feel the grass beneath his tiny hands. I set him down carefully, and for the first time he crawled freely, laughing softly. Sunlight fell on his hair, on his cheeks, and I felt a weight lift from my chest. He was alive, really alive, in a way he hadn't been in months. But still, shadows lingered. When I closed my eyes, I could see the nursery door, hear the whispering, feel the tight grip of my mother's hands. I wondered how normal families could live so freely, and I feared that I might carry this fear forever. Days turned into weeks, and Toby regained strength slowly. His laughter returned, faint at first, then louder, more confident. I could finally see him as my brother, not a fragile object to protect or mourn. But the house, our home, stayed empty and hollow. I returned to pack my things, sorting through the memories of walls that had watched, ceilings that had listened. Every photograph on the walls, every toy, every notebook felt like a part of a story I wasn't allowed to tell before. Victor's office, lined with monitors, computers, and cameras, became a symbol of control. I could finally walk through it without fear, though every keyboard stroke and camera lens haunted me in memory. Rachel's bedroom smelled faintly of disinfectant still. The vials she had hidden under her pillow were gone, replaced by official evidence bags. Social services arranged for me to live with my aunt in Bentonville, Arkansas. It was a small town with wide streets, tall trees, and a neighborly feeling I hadn't known in years. Toby and I adjusted slowly, learning that life could be simple, that love could be gentle. But some nights, silence fell heavy. I woke at 2:47 a.m., heart hammering, imagining scratches across the walls of a nursery that no longer existed. Toby would stir, and I'd breathe slowly, reminding myself, he was safe. I was safe. The most difficult part wasn't escaping the house. It was escaping the memory of control, the subtle terror that had been drilled into our lives. I realized that fear, when compounded over months of whispers, locks, and obsession, could feel permanent. Therapy helped, slowly. I learned to articulate the fear that had become second nature. Toby began talking more, expressing anger at his parents in ways I hadn't thought he could. We shared whispered conversations late at night about everything: the past, the strange rituals, the vials of sedatives, the hours of obsessive monitoring. I realized I wasn't just afraid of my parents. I was afraid of myself. Afraid I might have accepted their rules without question. That fear had been normalized. I learned to recognize it in real life. A controlling teacher, a harsh rule at school, a tone in someone's voice. I practiced saying no, practicing independence, slowly disentangling myself from the paranoia they'd instilled. And Toby taught me resilience. His tiny hands, once fragile, now held mine firmly. His laughter, once muted, now filled rooms. He reminded me that life could grow again, even from the tightest cage. Years later, I still remember that night we ran through the snow. I remember Toby's weight in my arms, the pounding of our hearts, the cold against our bare feet. I remember the police taking my parents away, their faces tight with anger and disbelief, their world unraveling around them. But I also remember the first morning we woke up safe, in a small apartment with sunlight streaming through the windows. Toby laughed freely, and I felt for the first time that the world could be gentle. I still wake up sometimes at 2:47 a.m., but now instead of fear, I think of survival. I think of courage. I think of responsibility. The responsibility to watch, to speak, to act, when someone cannot protect themselves. I learned that life isn't just about following rules or living in fear. It's about noticing, acting, and believing that freedom and love can exist beyond control. Sometimes, love becomes a cage when fear overrides reason. True care means protection without suffocation, vigilance without obsession, and freedom without danger. And when we see someone trapped, physically, emotionally, or mentally, our responsibility is to act, to speak, and to safeguard their right to life, laughter, and the air beneath their own wings. I grew up on Highway 91, that endless stretch of road in Fargo where the wheat fields reach the horizon, and the sky feels like it's pressing down on you. Our house leaned slightly to the west, paint peeling like dead skin, windows nailed shut as if to hold in all the secrets inside. We didn't have neighbors who came over except for the rare mailman or delivery truck. No one ever noticed if you disappeared for a while. I was the oldest of four, Jonah, 11, and Eli, 8, who followed me like shadows, and the twins, Gracie and Hope, 5, whose small hands I tried to protect. My parents, Marla and Dean Porter, were the kind of people who smiled in church and prayed over their kids while carrying darkness behind closed doors. Mom didn't work. Dad said women shouldn't. His philosophy was law. He worked at the grain elevator, lifting, shifting, getting covered in dust and sweat, and then coming home angry at the world, at us, at Mom. Dinner was never quiet. Any sound not permitted was punished. If you forgot your manners, if your voice was too loud, if you dared to glance at the wrong time, the closet awaited. I remember my first visit vividly. I was 9 and I'd forgotten to say sir when Dad passed the casserole. He shoved me inside. The door closed. The air was stale and cold. I tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed my voice. Hours passed. No food, no light, no mercy. I promised myself I'd never forget. By 13, things had grown worse. Dad started entering my room at night, and I learned quickly how to fake sleep, how to hold still for hours while my body trembled. One night, Mom caught him. She didn't yell. She just smiled, slow and bitter, a smile that burned deeper than anger. The next morning, she dragged me to the bathroom and slammed my face against the mirror. Blood ran down my cheek. Then the lighter. She pressed it against my shoulder, humming a hymn as if it justified her cruelty. I didn't cry. She hated crying. I began to keep a journal under a loose floorboard in my room. Not as an escape, not as hope, but as proof that I wasn't losing my mind. Every bruise, every lie, every threat, I documented it. The journal became my anchor. I could look at it and remember that the house, the parents, the punishments, none of it was my fault. But life on Highway 91 was a rhythm of fear and survival. I learned the soft creak of Dad's boots, the way Mom's voice shifted when she was about to strike, the exact decibel of a whisper that could earn a punishment. And all the while, the wheat fields outside whispered freedom, a promise I could almost feel but couldn't yet reach. When I turned 14, Dad was arrested for stealing tools at the grain elevator. He didn't fight it. He didn't resist. Mom, on the other hand, lost her mind. She poured whiskey into a cereal bowl, drank until she passed out on the couch, snoring with the bitter taste of alcohol still coating her lips. That night, I looked around the house, the cracked linoleum, the faint smell of bleach mixed with old sweat, the nail-covered windows, and realized we couldn't stay. I used a bent bobby pin I'd kept hidden for weeks to unlock the front door. My hands shook, the metal pricking my skin, but it worked. I went back inside, whispering their names to the twins first, then Jonah and Eli. "We're leaving. Now." Quietly, I said. Their eyes were wide, but they trusted me. They had to. We ran barefoot through the snow. I carried Hope. Jonah held Gracie's hand. Eli kept close to my side. Each step burned our feet, and the snow clung to our legs, soaking through our thin clothes. The house faded behind us, the porch sagging, the front door hanging open. It wasn't just the house we were leaving. We were leaving fear, chains, the endless punishments that had become our nights. We finally reached the diner off the highway, lights spilling warmth into the cold night. The cook's eyes went wide when he saw us, bleeding, barefoot, eyes wide with terror. He called 911 immediately. I remember leaning against the wall and then passing out. When I woke up, the smell of antiseptic and winter air filled my lungs, and strangers were talking to me kindly, gently. The police arrived quickly, finding evidence that confirmed what I had lived through for years. Cigarette burns on the twins' backs, bruises everywhere, malnutrition. My shoulder still burned from the lighter. We were placed in a hospital, wrapped in blankets that smelled faintly of soap and hospital disinfectant, the first safety we'd ever known. Officers and social workers questioned me. They were kind, but I had learned to be cautious. "Do you know your parents' names?" they asked. "Yes." "Were you ever hurt at home?" "Yes." "Can you tell me what happened?" I hesitated. Then, slowly, I told them the truth. About the closet, about the burns, about the nights that never ended. They listened. I could see that they believed me. It was the first time someone truly did. The newspapers called us the children of Highway 91, turning our trauma into a headline. People stared, whispered, and judged. I didn't cry. Not then. I had survived worse than strangers' opinions. The only thing I asked the officer when we were being processed was, "Do closets have lights in foster homes?" He smiled. "Yes, they do." That was enough. Foster care was strange. Every door had a lock, but I could open it. The beds were soft. The food was warm. I could leave a room without fear of punishment. At first it was terrifying. I jumped at shadows, flinched at raised voices, kept my journal hidden under the mattress. But gradually, I began to breathe again. I learned what safety sounded like. Laughter, soft music, the smell of clean laundry. I learned what love looked like. Caregivers who hugged, teachers who cared, kids who played without fear. Slowly, I let myself be seen. I showed Jonah, Eli, Gracie, and Hope that the world didn't always hurt. We shared stories, blankets, pancakes, and the first smiles that weren't forced. School became bearable. I made friends carefully, testing them, measuring their reactions to anger, fear, and disappointment. I had to learn trust one person at a time, but I also learned resilience. I learned that I could survive, that my brothers and sisters could survive, and that we had done nothing wrong. Now, years later, I can look back without panic. The memories of Highway 91 still exist. The closet, the burns, the cold snow beneath my feet. But they no longer define me. I know the house, the parents, the fear was not my fault. I survived. We survived. I still write sometimes, keeping journals to remember the past and to process the future. I talk to therapists and sometimes to friends about what happened. I laugh sometimes even. And I know that safety and love exist even when the world seems cruel. Children deserve protection, not punishment. Trauma can leave invisible scars, but with care, safety, and compassion, survivors can heal and reclaim their lives. No child should ever have to question whether a closet is safe. When I think back to the house on Juniper Lane, I remember it as if it were alive. Watching, judging, holding secrets I was only just beginning to understand. I was 14 then, too old to be afraid of monsters under the bed, too young to comprehend the kind of monsters that could live in your own home. My parents, Sandra and Lewis Taylor, were not like the parents at school. The ones who cooked dinner with laughter, kissed you on the forehead, and tucked you in without a lecture about hygiene or punctuality. Our house wasn't a home. It was a clockwork prison. Mom ran the kitchen like a laboratory. Every shelf labeled, every measuring cup in its place, every meal weighed to the gram. Dad had rules for everything. How to brush your teeth, how to walk across the living room without making noise, even how to breathe when climbing stairs. Chaos breeds weakness, he said, always standing in the doorway, eyes cold, watching. Mom would nod. We only protect what we love, she added, her voice soft, but not warm. I shared a room with my little brother Leo, who was 10 at the time. He was quiet, fragile, and easy to scare. Every night, we went to bed with one eye open, ears straining for the sound of a footstep, a whispered warning, or the click of a lock. It wasn't paranoia, it was training. I remember the first real sign something was wrong. A cookie went missing. Mom's eyes narrowed. You took it, she said. I hadn't, but I knew arguing would only make it worse. That was the beginning of a pattern, small disappearances, unexplainable rules, and punishments that didn't fit the crime. The first night I realized we weren't just in a strict household. We were trapped was the night Leo vanished. I woke up stretching, rubbing my eyes, and noticed the hallway lights were off. Leo? I whispered. Nothing. I called again. Silence. My stomach sank. I ran to the pantry, the one place I had always considered mundane, and there he was, curled under the shelves, shaking like a leaf. Mom's voice followed me into the room. It's safer here, she said, as if his trembling was something natural, harmless. From that night on, I started watching her closely. Every smile that didn't reach her eyes, every step she took through the house, every glance that seemed calculated. Dad wasn't easier. Sometimes he'd appear in the doorway after we were asleep, just standing there, whispering about obedience, about strength, about the cruel outside world that we must be ready for. One mistake, he said once, and the world will take what we cannot protect. I didn't know what he meant, not fully until the journals. I found them hidden behind a loose brick in the basement, pages upon pages of rules, proper speech, proper eating, proper posture, proper thoughts. Every time Leo or I made a small mistake, it was cataloged, analyzed, and stored. I realized then that our home wasn't a place of love. It was a controlled ecosystem, one where any deviation was punished. Fear had been planted in every corner, every object, every interaction. And I, at 14, understood for the first time that the only way out was to survive. The days blurred into weeks. Morning routines became drills. Every step, every word measured, scrutinized. Leo stopped speaking in full sentences. He would mumble under his breath when we were alone, afraid someone might hear. At school, I tried to act normal. Teachers commented on my quiet demeanor, on how polite I was. They had no idea. They didn't see the walls of the house closing in on us, the way Dad's eyes followed me like he could see my thoughts. Evenings were worse. Mom would bring the tablets to the table, videos, hours of footage of us disobeying, sneaking a cookie, talking too loudly, forgetting to rinse a dish properly. She'd point at the screen and whisper, "Do you see what happens when you disobey?" There was no room for argument. There were no allies, no friends visited. The neighbors never came over. School never asked questions. We were invisible, enclosed in a prison of fear. I started collecting small tools, wrenches, screwdrivers, even a small pocket knife. I kept them hidden under my mattress. Every day I plotted, thinking of ways to get Leo out, to escape the rules, the fear, the constant observation. It became an obsession. I'd watch my parents sleep, counting their breaths, timing the moments when the house was at its quietest. Every lock, every chain, every bolt was mapped in my head. I couldn't fail. Leo, pale and silent, was both my burden and my reason to keep going. He didn't talk much anymore, but his eyes followed mine when I whispered plans. I told him stories about a place where we could laugh, eat candy without punishment, breathe freely. It was dangerous even to imagine it, but imagining it kept us alive. One night I caught Dad moving the pantry lock one click tighter. He smiled. That smile, so casual, so proud, was the kind that makes your blood run cold. "Stay strong," he whispered. "The world is unforgiving." I wanted to scream, to fight, to call someone, anyone, but I knew there was no one. Survival wasn't about strength. It was about patience, stealth, and timing. The night finally came when the plan was ready. Mom and Dad had eaten dinner and gone to bed, exhausted from controlling every second of our lives. I nudged Leo awake. His eyes were wide, questioning, but he didn't ask. He trusted me. Together we crept to the pantry. The chains were cold under my fingers, heavy, but I had practiced this motion 100 times in my head. One click, 2 clicks, the chain fell away. We ran, barefoot, across the desert behind our house. The air burned our lungs, but every inhale tasted like freedom. The desert was silent except for our hurried footsteps. Hours passed. My legs ached. Leo's small hand in mine felt fragile but alive. Finally, a hiker spotted us, called the authorities. Mom and Dad were arrested, muttering about protection, love, rules, and obedience. We were placed in foster care. The pantry was emptied, journals burned. The world felt enormous, terrifying, and beautiful all at once. For the first time, I understood what it meant to breathe freely, to choose, to live. But even in the safety of our new home, I sometimes dream of the locks clicking behind me and wake gasping, heart hammering. The fear doesn't leave immediately. Life in foster care was hard in ways I didn't anticipate. I had to navigate rules that were different, confusing, sometimes arbitrary. The other kids didn't understand my silence, my obsession with order, my fear of loud laughter. But Leo and I had each other. We whispered plans of normalcy late at night, sharing dreams of ice cream, late-night movies, and no chains. Moments of normalcy became treasures. A walk through the park, the warmth of the sun on my face, even small jokes exchanged with strangers. But the memories of our old life lingered. Every sound of a chain rattling, every shadow moving across a hallway wall, made me tense. Trauma had a way of following us, even into the bright safety of freedom. Over time, we adjusted. Therapy sessions helped me untangle fear from reality. Leo laughed more freely now, though he sometimes glances at closets, afraid of shadows. I learned that survival doesn't always require obedience. Sometimes it requires courage, planning, and the willingness to leave behind what you once knew as home. The house on Juniper Lane still haunts my dreams, but I no longer live in fear. I learned to trust myself, to believe in my instincts, to protect my brother in ways that matter. True safety and growth cannot come from control or fear. Love without freedom is suffocating, and survival sometimes demands the courage to escape even those we once trusted. Real strength lies not in obedience, but in choosing life, hope, and freedom. I always thought art was supposed to make you feel something beautiful, like sunshine through a window or the smell of wet clay after a spring rain. But in my house, art was a weapon. My mother, Victoria Whitlock, called it discipline. Every afternoon after the bus dropped me off, I climbed the creaky stairs to the top floor of our old Eugene townhouse. The air up there smelled like turpentine varnish and the sharp bite of paint thinner. My mom stood at an easel, wearing paint-smeared clothes and a glare that could cut through steel. "You will create perfection," she said, voice tight like a drum, "or you will understand consequences." Dad, Martin, worked the night shift at a factory. He didn't interfere with our lessons. Mom said he was weak, and I think he agreed. He avoided her in the mornings, didn't argue, didn't question. That left me and my younger brother Liam to bear the full force of her expectations. Liam was 8, small, and endlessly nervous. We shared the studio, sitting side by side on paint-stained stools, hands stiff with the cold of the floorboards, paintbrushes clutched like lifelines. At first it felt like normal practice. Mom would demonstrate, showing how to sketch a line or blend colors perfectly. But mistakes weren't tolerated. A crooked brushstroke meant kneeling in the dark corner for hours. If clay cracked, our fingers raw from smoothing it again, she wouldn't let us stop until she deemed it right. I began hiding tiny sketches beneath floorboards, secret worlds where Liam and I weren't prisoners, where laughter existed without fear. The walls of the studio were covered with her art, portraits of neighborhood kids drawn with exaggerated terror in their eyes. She didn't ask permission, didn't care about consent. They were her experiments, her punishments immortalized on canvas. I watched her closely, memorizing patterns. When she hummed lullabies while painting, it was always a warning. When she whispered compliments, it was a trap. One evening, my curiosity pulled me toward a false cabinet in the corner. I discovered a hidden room behind it. It was dark, filled with mannequins draped in clothing from classmates. They were posed unnaturally, frozen mid-motion, staring. A camera hung from the ceiling, the red light blinking rhythmically. Nearby, my mom's notebook lay open. Lists of punishments, rewards, and experiments with fear spilled across pages. My chest tightened. We weren't alone. We were just the latest subjects. Fear became a constant companion. I stopped laughing, stopped speaking unless necessary, and learned to bend to her rhythm like water shaping to a container. Yet somewhere beneath the anxiety, a spark of defiance grew. I began planning, each sketch hidden, each key noted, every moment of distraction recorded in my memory. Liam didn't understand the danger yet, but I whispered to him at night, telling him stories about a life outside that studio. It was my way of keeping hope alive. Days in the studio stretched endlessly. My mom timed everything with precision. Meals, brushstrokes, bathroom breaks, each scheduled and observed. I learned to anticipate her moods. If her eyebrows twitched while mixing paint, we'd stay still until she calmed. If the floor creaked under our stools, we froze mid-breath. Liam's small body trembled constantly. He learned to obey quickly, because mistakes were punished severely. Once, he wet himself from sheer exhaustion. Mom dragged him into the cold hallway and made him kneel on the tile for an hour, ignoring his shivering. I wanted to scream, to fight, but I had learned that rebellion meant pain. So I stayed silent, comforted him afterward with whispered reassurances. It wasn't much, but it was all I could give. Our school life offered no refuge. My teachers noticed the quiet, the nervous glances, the way Liam sometimes refused to speak. But home was where discipline ruled. Every night, I sketched under floorboards, drawings of escape routes, imaginary forests, and sunlit meadows far from the smell of paint. My mind clung to these secrets. They were fuel for courage, the promise that one day we could be free. Mom's studio was full of surveillance, cameras hid in corners, small bells attached to doors. I mapped their locations obsessively. I studied my mother's patterns, when she painted, when she checked emails, when she left the house briefly. Every detail mattered. Survival required precision, patience, and planning. One rainy afternoon, while she was mixing oils on the main canvas, I overheard her muttering about her past students, how some failed and others learned the lesson. My stomach churned. It wasn't art. It was fear. I realized the mannequins weren't just displays, they were warnings. The red light of the camera blinked at me. I memorized its position, the wires snaking along the ceiling. It became a game of strategy, a puzzle we had to solve to survive. I started small, testing boundaries. I distracted Mom while Liam snuck the key from her apron pocket. I mapped the fire escape route, memorizing each step down the rickety staircase, the latch on the back door, the alley that led to safety. I watched her nightly habits, the way she checked locks, the sequence she followed when leaving the room. I rehearsed with Liam. When I say go, we move, I whispered. His eyes were wide, but he nodded. I'll follow you. It was terrifying, but also necessary. I felt a strange calm whenever we practiced. It was the first sense of control I had ever felt. The rainy Thursday arrived. Mom was absorbed in painting, humming a tune I knew by heart. Every step I had memorized came into play. Liam's small fingers clenched mine. "Ready?" I asked. He nodded. I slid the key into the lock, holding my breath as the latch clicked softly. It was a sound we'd longed to hear for months. The rain soaked us instantly, cold, sharp, and real. We ran barefoot across the cobblestones behind our townhouse. The world outside was immense, terrifying, and alive. My lungs burned, Liam stumbled, but we didn't stop. Every sound, every shadow made me tense. I was hyper-aware of danger, of someone catching us. Finally, a neighbor saw us, called the authorities. We pounded on the door, soaked and shaking. Moments later, police arrived. The studio was discovered in horrifying detail. Mannequins, cameras, notes documenting fear and punishment. My mother claimed it was art, a pursuit of perfection, but the officers saw the bruises, the malnourishment, the terror in our eyes. She was arrested on the spot. Liam and I were placed in foster care. For the first time, I felt warmth, light, and freedom. Yet the memories of the studio lingered, the red blinking camera, the frozen eyes of mannequins haunting my dreams. Foster care was difficult in its own ways. The rules were strict, but not cruel. I learned to trust again, to speak freely, to laugh without fear. Liam started smiling more often, though he sometimes flinched at sudden movements or sharp sounds. We began to rebuild ourselves. Small joys, a walk in the park, a shared ice cream cone, an unobserved bedtime story, became treasures. I kept my sketches, but now they were for me alone, not to please or survive. I painted what I felt, not what I feared. Even now, years later, I sometimes dream of the studio, the red blinking camera, the mannequin's eyes staring. But I remind myself that art is supposed to inspire, not terrorize. I survived, and I learned that courage and hope are stronger than fear and control. True creativity and growth cannot thrive under fear and punishment. Love, art, and life require freedom, patience, and kindness. Courage is the key to escaping oppression and reclaiming your own story. I was 12 when the knocking started. 3 soft taps, always the same, always around 2:30 a.m. The sound came from the hallway outside my bedroom, muffled but sharp enough to jolt me awake. At first I thought it was the old house settling, the floorboards groaning, pipes contracting, but the timing was too precise, too deliberate. My mom, Darlene, noticed my restless nights and one evening told me, "Evan, if you hear someone knock at night and it's not me, don't open the door." Her voice was quiet, almost fearful, but firm. I nodded, though I didn't understand why she seemed so scared. Our house on Mill Street was one of the older homes in Toledo. Cracked sidewalks led up to a porch that sagged in the middle, and the windows always seemed covered with curtains no one opened. The streetlights flickered like they couldn't make up their minds, and the neighbors, if they existed, were ghosts. I spent most of my days trying to make myself invisible, keeping my head down at school, walking the same route home, avoiding attention at all costs. Mom worked nights at a motel off I-75, which meant I mostly stayed alone with Dad. Rick McGrath hadn't worked in years. He claimed a back injury, but I didn't see him struggle physically. He mostly sat in the living room chair, drinking beer, chain-smoking cigarettes, muttering to the walls or occasionally yelling at Mom for reasons I couldn't understand. The smell of stale alcohol and sweat clung to the furniture, and every small argument felt like walking on glass. I learned early to stay silent, to keep my eyes down, to disappear. The first real fight I remember happened over dinner, or what passed for it. Macaroni noodles overcooked and mushy in a chipped orange bowl. I remember Mom saying softly, "Evan, eat slowly, okay?" Dad snapped, "Eat? Eat this crap?" He slammed his hand on the table, sending the bowl sliding across the counter. Mom flinched back. I froze. The yelling escalated, shouts echoing through the house, punctuated by the clatter of plates. That night, I stayed awake listening, wishing the knocking would come early, just so it could mask the sound of arguments. By 13, I realized the knocking wasn't something to fear, but a strange anchor. It reminded me that rules existed, that someone in the house could still protect me, at least in theory. Mom always said, "The knocking is just a warning. Don't open, don't speak, don't give them power." I obeyed, learning early the delicate art of survival, of keeping my life contained within walls that often felt like a cage. By the time I turned 16, the routine had calcified. I went to school, did my homework, helped Mom when she came home from the motel, and avoided Dad whenever possible. But the tension never left. The house smelled permanently of damp, alcohol, and fear, and the knocks continued at 2:30 a.m. sharp. They were subtle now, almost comforting, a twisted reminder that rules still existed, even in the chaos. I remember the Sunday morning clearly. The air smelled like cheap beer and burnt coffee. Mom had gone to the store late the night before, leaving me alone with Dad. I opened the fridge, searching for something edible, maybe leftover spaghetti, a slice of bread, anything. All I found was a half-empty bottle of mustard and a few cans of beer. Dad lay sprawled on the living room chair, snoring, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He woke up halfway through breakfast. His eyes were red, the veins prominent. "You hate it here, don't you?" he spat. I didn't answer. Mom's voice came from the kitchen, strained and careful. "Rick, eat something. Stop staring at him like that." He laughed, a sharp, bitter laugh. "Eat? Why should he eat? Let him feel the misery I feel every day." I felt my stomach knot. The air in the room thickened like molasses. Then Mom snapped. "If you hate it here, leave," she said softly, almost whispered, almost hopeful. Dad slammed his hand onto the table, making the dishes jump. "Say that again." He grabbed a hammer from the counter. My vision narrowed. I saw the worn wood handle, the dull shine of the metal, and I felt something click inside me, something that had been clicking since I was 12, since the knocks began. I don't remember the decision forming. I only remember the sound, sharp, like cracking ice. And then silence. I moved before he could react. 4 swings, each one precise, trained by years of silent watching, of imagining consequences, of counting the knocks. When it was over, I didn't panic, I didn't cry. I just waited, heart hammering, listening to the low groans of the house. Mom came home 4 hours later, humming softly as she unlocked the door. She froze when she saw him. I stood behind her, calm. "I did it," I said quietly. Her eyes widened. "Evan, you..." She choked, words failing her. I only nodded. The knocking had always warned me. Now it seemed to approve. For 3 days I stayed in the house. Mom barely spoke. She didn't know how to respond to my silence. I propped their bodies at the kitchen table, faces upright, eyes taped open, chairs adjusted so it seemed like they were eating. I cooked simple meals, cold cereal, toast, water, and ate beside them. The knocking continued, but now it was accompanied by a whispering voice. "Good job." I spoke to them sometimes, pretending the conversation was normal. "Pass the salt, Dad." "Nothing." "Mom, can you hand me the toast?" Silence. The house smelled like rust and rot, but to me it was normal. Every sound, the creaking of the floor, the tapping of the pipes, the whispers of the knocking, felt like the rhythm of life. Neighbors eventually noticed something was wrong. Police arrived, saw the scene, and took me away. They didn't understand. I smiled the whole time, explaining only what I needed. The knocking never stopped. It tells me what to do. Doctors called it psychosis, disassociation, trauma. I called it survival. The psychiatric unit became my new home. Every day felt like a rerun. Meals served, rooms checked, therapists asking questions I didn't answer. I learned to manipulate time, to hide emotions, to exist quietly in the corners. I drew, I wrote, I imagined the knocking, always 3 soft taps, always instructing me, always there when the real world failed to make sense. Other kids came and went, some with similar stories, some with simpler issues. I didn't bond. I didn't trust. The knocking was the only constant. Nurses tried to talk to me, asking about my parents, my feelings. I lied. I watched. I waited. The world outside had betrayed me, and now I had to survive in silence with only the echoes of old rules and whispers guiding me. Years later, I look back and try to understand what happened. The knocking was never real in the way most people understand. It was fear. It was instinct. It was years of survival drilled into me. My parents had failed me. The system had failed me, and yet I survived. I still hear it sometimes faintly when I am alone. 3 soft taps at night, reminding me that rules matter, that boundaries exist even when chaos surrounds you. I have learned to live with it, to channel it into focus rather than action. Violence is never a solution, and no child should bear the burden of survival at the cost of innocence. But the story teaches this. Trauma shapes the mind in profound ways, and understanding, support, and intervention are not optional. They are life-saving. Neglect, abuse, and silence can turn fear into horror, and fear into action. The world must listen before the knocking starts. I can still remember the smell of our kitchen, the sharp tang of paprika, burnt oil lingering in the air, and something strangely sweet that clung to the walls like a secret. It was the smell of my mother, Celia Hargrove, and of the fear she instilled in us. Dinner was never just dinner in the Hargrove house. It was a test, a stage, a lesson in obedience. My sister Sophie and I learned early that a mistake, no matter how small, could earn punishment. I was 10 when I first realized my mother's discipline wasn't ordinary. That night, dinner had been late. A pot of spaghetti boiled over, filling the room with the acrid smell of burnt noodles. Sophie, in her rush to salvage the mess, dropped some on the table. Mom's face twisted. Her eyes, usually calm, were wild and sharp. "You spilled the spaghetti," she hissed, grabbing a metal skimmer. "Do you know what that means?" I tried to intervene. "Mom, it was an accident." She turned on me, voice low and dangerous. "I'm teaching you to respect the table," she spat. "Do you think respect is optional?" Dad, Martin, lounged on the couch with a beer in hand, nodding silently. He never interfered, never stopped her. He just watched as we shrank under her gaze, their combined authority shaping every move we made. I remember the way Sophie's hand smoldered after Mom pressed the skillet against her palm, testing her compliance. Sophie whimpered but didn't cry. That was rule 1, never cry. I remember biting my lip, my own fear so thick it tasted like ash. By the time I turned 12, I began noticing patterns. Mom prepared elaborate meals with the precision of a chef and an artist combined. She photographed every dish before we ate, insisting that Sophie and I pose with plates held just so. "Presentation is everything," she'd say, her voice sweet but edged with danger. One night, I asked her why we had to pose. "Why can't we just eat?" Her smile was slow, almost serene, but it twisted at the edges. "Because perfection matters," she whispered, eyes bright. "And some people don't understand it." Dad would sometimes frown at her methods, the disapproval clear in the slump of his shoulders or the frown that rarely left his face. Mom noticed, of course. When he spoke against her, her calm smile shifted into something colder, something that made me shrink back instinctively. And Sophie? I watched her begin to forget things. Words, numbers, even names. That night she couldn't remember how to add fractions. Mom locked her in the pantry with a single candle and a notebook. She had to write down the recipe for every dish she had eaten correctly. If she missed one, Mom warned, the punishment would increase. "This is love," Mom said when I pleaded for her to let Sophie out. But it didn't feel like love, it felt like control. Even now I can close my eyes and see that dining room. Mom had an obsession with perfection that extended beyond us. When the police arrived after a concerned neighbor reported screams late one evening, they didn't find what anyone could have expected. The dining table was set meticulously, not just for Sophie and me, but for the mannequins she had arranged around the room. They were dressed in aprons and chef hats, seated upright as though they were dining alongside us. Mom stood behind them, clapping slowly, tears streaking her cheeks. Sophie crouched in the corner, whispering recipes as instructed, terrified yet precise. She had memorized each step, each measurement, each tiny detail. My stomach twisted as I realized the lengths Mom would go to enforce her rules. She believed in perfection so much that reality had no place for error. Dad had disappeared weeks before, leaving only notes on the counter. "Discipline is eternal," one read. "They'll understand when they're ready." Mom had read them, nodded, and continued her work. I don't think she even grieved him. His absence seemed irrelevant, as though nothing in our house mattered more than her rules. The officers gently separated us, wrapping Sophie and me in blankets. I remember Sophie's pale face, her fingers trembling, her hands still trying to arrange invisible dishes in proper order. "It's not real," I whispered. "They're gone now." But even I didn't believe myself. The precision, the control, the smell of burnt oil and paprika, those things didn't leave. They lingered in the corners of the mind. Even in foster care, the Hargrove house haunted me. I'd wake in the middle of the night, smell the paprika, the burnt oil, the sweetness of candy mixed with ash. Sometimes I'd see Mom's shadow at the doorway of my foster room, a knife in hand, a smile that promised punishment. I had nightmares where I had to present meals perfectly. If I made a mistake, someone would burn me, or Sophie, or both of us. I would wake sweating, clutching the sheets, trying to convince myself I was safe. But the fear was a stubborn companion. Therapy helped, but slowly. I began to realize that my mother's obsession was never about food, never about manners. It was about power and control. Every perfect dish, every photograph, every whispered rule was a chain that bound us to her will. Sophie recovered gradually, though she struggled with memory gaps and anxiety. I protected her as best I could, sometimes pretending to be stronger than I felt. I became vigilant, watching every movement, noticing patterns, memorizing locations of dangerous objects. Fear had taught me awareness, if nothing else. Years passed. Sophie and I adjusted to our new lives in foster care, in a home where meals were normal, where we weren't constantly tested. My nightmares became less frequent, though the smell of paprika would occasionally bring tears to my eyes. I learned to speak up, to recognize when authority becomes abuse, and to advocate for myself and others. School became a place of discovery rather than survival. Friends didn't expect perfection. They expected honesty and kindness. That was a strange, wonderful freedom. Mom remained in prison, her obsession with perfection intact. News articles detailed her crimes, the mannequins, the recipes, the cruelty. Even from afar, she retained her power over the memory of our childhood. But Sophie and I were no longer victims in her house. We were survivors. Now I'm 14, and I can cook without fear. I can eat without trembling. Sophie laughs freely, her hands no longer shaking when she sets a table. We still talk about the past, gently, carefully, understanding that fear shaped us, but it doesn't define us. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I smell the paprika, and I see Mom's shadow, hear her whispers, but I remind myself, we survived. We're allowed to be imperfect. We are allowed to make mistakes. And more importantly, we are allowed to live. I've learned that control is never love. Love allows mistakes, nurtures growth, and sets boundaries that protect rather than punish. I carry that lesson with me every day, ensuring that Sophie and I will never again be trapped by fear masquerading as care. Perfection without compassion is cruelty. True love nurtures and protects without control, teaches without fear, and allows mistakes without punishment. The greatest gift we can give is freedom. The freedom to grow, to err, and to live without chains of fear. When we first moved to Willow Creek Lane, I knew something had shifted in the air. The house was old, all creaking floors and drafty corners, the kind of place where shadows didn't behave. Mom, Patricia, had lost her job at the bakery, and Dad, Greg, spent hours tinkering with garage doors and ancient radios in the garage. He would disappear for long stretches, muttering to himself or to the tools, and sometimes I caught him staring into corners where no one stood. I was 13, the oldest of 3, and immediately felt the weight of responsibility. Max, 9, and Oliver, 7, looked to me for guidance, though they didn't know what guidance even meant in a house like ours. Mom had a way of making us afraid of everything. "For your own good," she'd say, voice calm but firm. And for a while I believed her, because she was all we had. Dinner was quiet, too quiet. If we laughed or even spoke above a whisper, she would drag us upstairs to the thinking room. It had no windows, a single chair bolted to the floor, and walls lined with photographs of children I didn't know, pale faces frozen in expressions of obedience. "We must learn to control chaos," she said each time she shut the door. I learned quickly to move silently through the house. Every creak, every whisper from the walls, every shadow was a potential danger. Sometimes I heard footsteps when no one was there and Dad muttering to corners in the kitchen. I tried to convince myself it was imagination, but deep down, I knew something had gone horribly wrong. One afternoon, Max disappeared. I searched every room, panicked, before finally finding him in the crawl space under the living room. He was curled into a ball, rocking back and forth, pale and shivering. "Mom said it's safer here," he whispered. Rage and terror twisted in my chest. My little brother had been hiding for 2 hours, thinking it would protect him. That night, Mom locked all the doors and boarded the windows. She paced the living room, whispering about men who take children. I didn't understand then that she meant us, that the danger she claimed to protect us from was mostly imaginary, and that her real obsession was control. I began leaving notes for Oliver and hiding scraps of food, small acts of rebellion and survival. "Don't trust her," I wrote. But even my plans felt fragile, like paper against a storm. Dad spent more nights in the garage, the door closed, muttering, sometimes carrying tools into the house. One evening I confronted him. "Dad, what are you doing? What are you making?" He looked at me, smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's for protection, Lydia," he said softly. "For all of you." I didn't believe him. Not really. Something in the air, something in Mom's eyes, told me we weren't safe. Not in the house. Not even in the garage. The thinking room became a place I feared more than the darkness outside. Once inside, the chair felt like a throne of judgment. Mom would stand in front of me, eyes piercing, hands clenched. "You must understand order," she said. "Chaos destroys." I watched Oliver sit there once, trembling, trying to control the shaking of his legs. Max had been in there too, his small shoulders hunched in silent apology for crimes he hadn't committed. Mom's voice would echo in the hallways even after the door closed. Learn control or face consequence. At night, I started hearing whispers through the walls. Footsteps padded across empty floors. I knew I wasn't imagining it entirely. Mom and Dad weren't alone in their obsessions. The house had absorbed the tension, the fear, and it whispered it back at me when I least expected it. One evening, I heard Mom moving through the hall with a syringe. My heart froze. "They won't know fear until they feel it," she whispered to herself. My stomach twisted. She wasn't protecting us from the world. She was protecting herself from our freedom, from our independence, from our small acts of self-determination. I realized then that we had no allies in that house. Dad's muttering and tools meant nothing. He had long surrendered his conscience to Mom's will. I had to be the one to save us, to see the danger clearly and act. By now, hiding and planning had become second nature. Max and Oliver learned to follow my lead without question. I began scouting escape routes, crawl spaces, unlocked windows, boards that could be pried away quietly. Every day was a calculation, a balance between risk and patience. One morning I discovered a closet locked from the inside. Inside were Max and Oliver, pale and shaking. Mom's calm voice floated from the doorway. "It's safer this way." Rage surged in me. I couldn't breathe properly. Rage and fear fused into a single purpose. We had to leave. That night, when Mom and Dad were asleep, I picked the lock with a hairpin I'd hidden in my sock. Whispering, I nudged the boys. "We leave now. Quietly, slowly. Don't look back." We ran barefoot down the street, snow melting under our feet, our small footprints leaving temporary marks on the white ground. We didn't stop until a neighbor opened the door, eyes wide in shock. Social workers arrived minutes later, faces serious, hands gentle. Mom and Dad were arrested, muttering about the world outside being cruel. But I didn't care. I only cared that my brothers were safe, that we had survived, that the shadow of Willow Creek Lane no longer held us captive. Foster care wasn't easy. Max and Oliver were terrified of strangers, of authority, of normality itself. Every raised voice made them flinch. Every closed door made them tremble. But I stayed by them, holding their hands, whispering that we were free, that we didn't have to be afraid anymore. Therapy helped, gradually. I learned to identify my own fear. The way it twisted decisions made me doubt myself. I realized that Mom and Dad had weaponized their anxiety and turned it into oppression. The world wasn't cruel in the same way they believed. It was simply indifferent, and we had been denied the chance to live freely. School became a sanctuary. I learned to smile, to laugh, to participate without fear. My brothers slowly followed, trusting me to navigate these new, ordinary landscapes. We could play outside, go to friends' houses, and feel sunlight on our skin without it being a prelude to punishment. Years later, I still remember the cold of that winter night, the feel of snow melting under my bare feet, and the pounding of our hearts as we ran toward freedom. Max and Oliver laugh more freely now. I've learned that fear, once learned, lingers, but it doesn't have to define me. The house on Willow Creek Lane remains empty in memory, a place that no longer controls us. But I carry the lessons it taught me: vigilance, awareness, courage. Most importantly, I learned that children deserve freedom, and that protecting them doesn't mean imprisoning them in fear. I've grown older, and I cook with confidence, laugh without hesitation, and speak without trembling. The shadows sometimes linger in the corners of my mind, but I remind myself, we survived, and surviving means living. Real love allows mistakes, allows freedom, allows life. Fear disguised as protection can be as dangerous as any real threat. True care nurtures without control, teaches without terror, and allows growth without imprisonment. The greatest act of love is letting someone live, free from chains of fear, and guiding them safely into the world. When I think back to my life before escape, I remember the smell first: stale coffee, a little burnt, mixed with the tension that hung in the air like fog. My little sister Tessa and I lived in a house that felt alive with rules, a house that measured our every move. Mom, Elaine, and Dad, Roger, weren't cruel in the normal sense. They weren't monsters with fangs or claws. Their cruelty was quieter, more precise. They believed in perfection, in control, in shaping us into obedient little soldiers. At first, the punishments were subtle. Mom would glare when we weren't chewing properly, sigh loudly if our backs weren't straight. But the quiet escalated into yelling, objects flying across the room, slammed doors, broken plates. Dad, sometimes silent, sometimes loud, enforced his own brand of discipline. If we didn't comply perfectly, he would slap, scold, and lecture us about respect. Tessa was 8, soft-spoken, quick to cry. I was 12, protective by nature, terrified by design. Mom treated our dinner table like a military drill. Carrots in straight lines, green beans beside them, counted, measured. Silverware aligned as if a general inspected the troops. A single grimace, a laugh too loud, a breath taken incorrectly. Any of these could send you to the quiet room. I remember the first time Tessa was sent there. She hadn't noticed a carrot had rolled over a line. Mom's voice thundered, sharp and precise. Quiet room. Now. Tessa blinked, wide-eyed, and I knew we'd been marked. That small closet, lit by a single bulb, became the embodiment of fear. She cried quietly, head against the mattress, waiting for permission to exist again. Dad sometimes encouraged Mom quietly, whispering about making us perfect, teaching us obedience before thought. I wanted to scream, but the walls of the house were full of eyes, even invisible ones, I swore. And shouting meant punishment, escalation, consequences. Weeks passed, and we became shadows of ourselves. I memorized routines. When Mom went to the bathroom, when Dad napped, when the lights flickered or the oven clicked. I memorized patterns because survival depended on prediction. Every footstep was measured, every movement calculated. One night, it all came to a head. I had reached my limit. Mom's hidden camera had recorded us for weeks, and she replayed it obsessively, criticizing our faces, our expressions, our every reaction to food or silence. I realized then that no one outside mattered. The neighbors, the school bus, the outside world. None of it existed in our reality. Only obedience did. The longer it went on, the more precise everything became. Mom labeled the cabinet shelves, measuring the distance between plates. She made us arrange our rooms with military precision. Dad would inspect, nod, or slap if we failed. I began tracking the tiny cracks in their routines. Mom had a way of making even breathing a lesson. If we breathed too quickly while eating, she would lecture us about control. "Your faces will reflect obedience," she said once, pointing at Tessa and me with a knife-edge tone. I started thinking about ways to fight back, but planning was delicate. Any mistake, any whisper of a plan discovered, could end us. Tessa became my shadow, clinging to me as I devised our survival strategies. I hid tools and small objects from the garage, imagining one day we might need them. One afternoon, I snuck into the living room, glanced at the hidden camera Mom had installed behind a vase. I traced the wires, memorized the angle, imagined unplugging it. The house had to be watched constantly. That was the only way to be safe. Understanding every hidden eye, anticipating every threat. By now the quiet room had become a symbol, a looming reminder of obedience. Every trip there reinforced that fear was the most effective weapon. Even small mistakes mattered. I couldn't let Tessa make them. Weeks of observation led to a plan. I gathered courage I didn't know I had. Tessa and I waited until Mom and Dad fell asleep, their snores deep and steady. The hammer I had taken from the garage felt heavy in my hands, a symbol of our possible freedom. We crept through the hallway, moving like shadows ourselves. Tessa clutched my hand, breathing shallow, trusting me completely. I tied Mom and Dad to chairs in the kitchen quietly, ensuring they couldn't reach phones or keys. Mom woke first, screaming, but I held fast. Dad stirred, tried to grab his phone, but the hammer stayed firm in my grip. The night stretched, taut with tension. Their angry words and accusations were meaningless in the cold glow of our decision. We were taking our lives back. Every scream, every thrash was just sound now, powerless against the will of children who had learned to endure and plan. By morning, they were restrained, mumbling about discipline and love. I looked at Tessa, saw her trembling but proud eyes, and knew that we had crossed the line from fear to action. We dragged them outside, the neighbors staring wide-eyed as our parents struggled against their bonds. Calls were made. The cops arrived, shaking their heads at the situation. No real danger existed, only the evidence of a household run by obsession and fear. Tessa and I said nothing, simply walked away. For the first time, we ate without fear. Plates clattered harmlessly. Silverware was used without strict alignment, and laughter came naturally. The foster care system embraced us cautiously, teaching us routines of safety rather than control. I began noticing the small joys: unstructured mornings, imperfect meals, voices that weren't reprimanding. We learned to trust our senses in each other. Slowly, the chains of obsession loosened, replaced by guidance and care. Even now, years later, the memory lingers. I sometimes dream of perfectly lined carrots, Tessa's frightened eyes, Mom's voice echoing rules. But waking life has taught me a different lesson. Fear may shape us, but it does not define us. We learn to laugh without warning, to eat without measurement, to sleep without locks. Every small choice reminds me that freedom is fragile but real, and that survival means claiming that freedom when opportunity arises. Our parents' obsession with perfection failed because love without freedom is not love at all. And I carry that lesson daily, protecting Tessa and myself, ensuring that no fear can dictate our lives again. Control disguised as care is a prison. True love allows mistakes, nurtures growth, and values freedom. Children need protection, but not at the cost of their autonomy, their joy, or their ability to breathe without fear. Survival is not just escaping danger. It is claiming the right to live fully, freely, and without chains.